The fastest way to lose everything is to believe no one can question your authority. The conference room on the 12th floor of the federal courthouse had already filled with senior attorneys, investigators, and department officials. Yet one chair remained empty. A digital clock on the wall quietly advanced from 4:28 to 4:29 as folders stamped with federal seals rested untouched in front of every attendee. No one spoke above a whisper because everyone in the room knew the same thing. The meeting could not begin until one particular attorney arrived. A senior official glanced toward the window overlooking the city skyline before checking a phone for the fourth time in less than 2 minutes. The call rang. There was no answer. Another official looked down at the printed agenda and slowly closed the folder. "That is not like her," he said quietly. Around the table, several people nodded. She had built a reputation over nearly 2 decades for arriving early, never late. If she had not answered her phone, something unexpected had happened. 45 minutes earlier, the afternoon sun stretched across Highway 17 as traffic moved steadily toward Richmond. Black United States Attorney Ava Carter guided her charcoal gray sedan through the right lane with quiet confidence, the radio playing softly while a leather briefcase rested on the passenger seat beside a neatly organized stack of federal case files. Her calendar for the day had been planned down to the minute. Every mile mattered because the meeting ahead involved a coordinated legal strategy that had taken months to prepare. She glanced briefly at the dashboard clock before returning her attention to the road. Everything remained exactly on schedule. Then blue emergency lights suddenly appeared in her rearview mirror. Ava immediately activated her turn signal, reduced her speed, and carefully pulled onto the wide shoulder. The traffic around her continued flowing at nearly 70 miles per hour, while warm summer air drifted across the open highway. She turned off the engine, lowered both front windows slightly, and placed her hands calmly on the steering wheel where they could be seen. Years of legal experience had taught her that professionalism often begins long before the first word is spoken. Behind her, white police officer Daniel Brooks stepped out of his patrol vehicle with measured confidence. He adjusted the body camera attached to his uniform, straightened his duty belt, and approached the driver's side with the steady pace of someone who believed he already understood the situation before asking a single question. His eyes swept across the vehicle, pausing on the expensive briefcase, the government parking permit displayed inside the windshield, and the professional attire worn by the woman sitting quietly behind the wheel. Instead of seeing details, he saw assumptions. Ava lowered the window the rest of the way and offered a courteous smile. "Good afternoon, officer." Brooks acknowledged the greeting with only a brief nod before asking for her driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. Ava informed him exactly where each document was located before reaching for them slowly and handing everything over with both hands. Brooks studied the license longer than necessary, comparing the photograph with the woman in front of him several times before looking back toward the road. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Richmond," Ava answered. "For work." Brooks narrowed his eyes slightly. "What kind of work?" Ava remained composed. "Legal work." The answer seemed simple, yet something about her calm confidence unsettled him. Imagine standing on the side of a busy American highway, knowing you have done everything correctly, yet realizing the person questioning you has already decided who you are before learning a single fact. Neither of them knew that one unanswered phone call was already beginning to change both of their futures. Daniel Brooks accepted Ava Carter's documents without another word and walked back toward his patrol vehicle, while the steady flow of traffic rushed past only a few feet away. The blue emergency lights reflected across the polished surface of her sedan, flashing against the guardrail in a slow rhythm that made the entire roadside seem frozen in time. Ava remained exactly where she had been. Instructed to stay, her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel as she watched the officer disappear behind the windshield of his cruiser. She had spent years inside federal courtrooms where emotions often threatened to overwhelm facts, and experience had taught her that patience was sometimes the strongest argument a person could make. Inside the patrol vehicle, Brooks entered her information into the computer terminal with practice speed. He glanced at the screen, frowned slightly, and typed again. Every search returned the same result. Her driver's license was valid. The vehicle registration matched. The insurance policy was current. There were no warrants, no alerts, and no outstanding violations. He leaned back in his seat for a moment, staring through the windshield toward Ava before requesting an additional records check through dispatch. The dispatcher confirmed that the information was processing, leaving Brooks to wait in silence. Waiting was never something he enjoyed. Outside, a gentle breeze carried the scent of warm pavement across the shoulder, while long shadows stretched over the highway. Ava noticed a family traveling in a sport utility vehicle slow briefly as children looked curiously toward the flashing patrol lights before disappearing into the distance. A delivery truck rumbled past, followed by a commuter bus filled with passengers eager to reach home before dark. To every passing driver, it looked like another routine traffic stop. No one could have guessed that every additional minute was quietly changing the course of two careers. Brooks stepped back out of his cruiser, holding her license in one hand. "How long have you been working in legal services?" he asked. Ava answered politely. "Several years." "Private practice?" "No. Government." She smiled slightly. "Yes." Brooks waited for her to elaborate, but she offered nothing beyond the question he had asked. Something about her calm confidence unsettled him. He looked toward the leather briefcase visible on the passenger seat. It appeared well used but carefully maintained, the kind carried by someone accustomed to organized work rather than hurried travel. "What is inside the briefcase?" he asked. "Case files and work materials," Ava replied. "Anything I should know about?" "Only that some of the documents are protected by federal confidentiality requirements." Brooks narrowed his eyes. "Federal?" Ava nodded once. "Yes. Imagine standing beside your own vehicle, answering every question respectfully, providing every requested document, and still feeling that each truthful answer only creates another layer of suspicion." Ava never argued because she understood something Brooks had not yet realized. Facts do not become stronger when spoken louder. They simply remain true. At that exact moment, her cell phone resting inside the center console illuminated with an incoming call. The screen glowed for several seconds before fading back into darkness. Brooks noticed it immediately. "You were getting a lot of calls," he observed. Ava glanced toward the phone but made no effort to reach for it. "Someone is probably wondering where I am." Nearly 40 miles away, inside the federal courthouse, another unanswered call had already begun raising questions that would soon travel far beyond the walls of a single conference room. Daniel Brooks looked once more at the dark screen inside his patrol vehicle before stepping back toward Ava Carter with measured determination. The records check had revealed nothing unusual, yet he could not shake the feeling that she was withholding something. Instead of accepting the verified facts, he searched for questions that might confirm the conclusion he had already reached in his own mind. The evening sun settled lower behind the trees, casting long bands of golden light across the highway while the steady stream of passing vehicles continued without interruption. Ava remained beside her sedan exactly as instructed, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, and her attention fixed on the officer approaching her once again. "How often do you travel this route?" Brooks asked. "Whenever my work requires it," Ava answered. "Do you carry government documents regularly?" "When my responsibilities require them." Brooks folded his arms. "You seem very careful with your answers." Ava offered a calm smile. "I try to answer the questions that are asked." The response lingered in the warm evening air. Brooks had expected frustration by now. He had expected impatience, defensiveness, or an argument over the length of the stop. Instead, every answer remained respectful, measured, and impossible to challenge. Imagine standing there knowing that cooperation is not changing the outcome because someone has already decided what they expect to find. Ava understood that feeling all too well, yet she refused to let emotion replace discipline. Her years inside federal courtrooms had taught her that composure often speaks louder than anger. Brooks glanced toward the leather briefcase resting on the passenger seat. Through the window, he could also see a neatly organized planner, several color-coded folders, and a government parking permit secured beneath the windshield. Everything inside the vehicle reflected preparation and order, yet he continued viewing each detail through the lens of suspicion rather than evidence. "Would you mind opening the vehicle?" he asked. Ava answered carefully. Officer, I will comply with every lawful instruction. I simply ask that any inspection follow the proper procedure, because some materials inside are protected by federal confidentiality requirements. Brooks frowned slightly. You keep mentioning federal responsibilities. Because that is the truth. What agency? Ava paused for only a moment. I would prefer to discuss that once the appropriate process is followed. Brooks looked away without responding. Another notification illuminated the phone resting inside the center console before fading again. This time the vibration echoed softly through the quiet cabin. He noticed it immediately. That phone seems important. Ava nodded gently. Someone is expecting me. You are not concerned about missing the call? She answered without hesitation. Following lawful instructions comes first. The simplicity of the statement caught Brooks off guard. A person attempting to avoid questions would usually search for an excuse to reach the phone. Ava had made no such attempt. Nearly 40 miles away, the atmosphere inside the federal conference room had shifted. From curiosity to concern. A senior official closed the meeting agenda and quietly instructed an assistant to contact state transportation authorities to determine whether there had been an accident along Ava's route. Another attorney checked the time again before saying, She has never missed a federal briefing without notice. The room fell silent because everyone knew that statement was true. Back on Highway 17, Brooks reached for his shoulder radio and requested that a supervisor respond to his location. The dispatcher acknowledged the request and advised that a sergeant was already on the way. Ava heard every word but showed no reaction. She simply looked toward the horizon as the final light of day settled beyond the distant tree line, quietly realizing that the next person to arrive would see the same facts but perhaps through very different eyes. The first flash of amber lights appeared in the distance several minutes later as a supervisor vehicle exited the highway median and pulled in behind Daniel Brooks's patrol car. The quiet shoulder of Highway 17 briefly glowed beneath 3 sets of emergency lights, while the last colors of sunset faded into deep blue across the evening sky. Brooks straightened his uniform before the supervisor even stepped out of the vehicle. Sergeant Michael Reynolds approached with an unhurried stride, taking in the scene with the practiced eyes of someone who had handled hundreds of roadside encounters throughout his career. He looked first at Brooks, then at Ava Carter, and finally at the neatly parked sedan sitting several feet away. Nothing about the scene suggested urgency. Nothing suggested danger. What caught his attention instead was the amount of time that had already passed. "Good evening," Reynolds said calmly. "Can someone bring me up to speed?" Brooks immediately explained that he believed additional verification was necessary because several aspects of the driver's statements seemed incomplete. Reynolds listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding but never expressing agreement or disagreement. When Brooks finished, the sergeant simply asked one question. Did dispatch confirm her identification? Brooks hesitated for a brief moment. Yes. Any warrants? No. Any registration issues? No. Any evidence of criminal activity? Brooks paused again before answering. No. Reynolds remained silent for several seconds. The sound of passing traffic filled the space between them while a cool evening breeze moved across the shoulder. Imagine hearing four simple answers, each pointing toward the same conclusion, yet realizing the encounter is still continuing. Sometimes the quietest moments reveal the biggest questions. Reynolds walked toward Ava with a respectful smile. "Good evening, ma'am. I am Sergeant Michael Reynolds. Thank you for your patience." Ava returned the greeting politely. "Good evening, Sergeant. Have you followed every instruction that has been given to you today?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Has anyone prevented you from cooperating?" "No." Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "May I ask where you were traveling this afternoon?" "To Richmond for a scheduled federal meeting." "Were you expected at a specific time?" "Yes." "Have you been able to notify anyone about your delay?" Ava glanced briefly toward the phone resting inside the center console before answering. "No. I believed it was important to complete this traffic stop according to procedure before making any calls." Reynolds noticed the response immediately. There was no frustration in her voice, only discipline. At that exact moment, The phone illuminated once again with another incoming call before the screen slowly faded back to black. Brooks looked toward it, but Reynolds quietly followed the direction of the call with greater attention than before. "Those calls have been coming in regularly?" he asked. "Yes, Sergeant," Ava replied. "I imagine my office is trying to reach me." Reynolds looked back toward Brooks without saying anything. The silence itself carried weight. Brooks folded his arms, still convinced there had to be something missing from the story. Reynolds, however, had begun noticing something entirely different. Every verified fact supported Ava's explanation, while every unanswered question seemed to exist only in assumption. As the evening settled over the highway, another call came across Reynolds's radio, requesting an immediate status update from headquarters. He acknowledged the transmission, but before answering, he looked once more at Ava and quietly realized that the next few minutes would determine far more than the outcome of a routine traffic stop. Sergeant Michael Reynolds acknowledged the request from headquarters before lowering the radio from his shoulder and turning his full attention back to Ava Carter. The evening air had grown cooler, and the last streaks of sunlight disappeared beyond the tree line, leaving the shoulder of Highway 17 illuminated almost entirely by the rhythmic flashes of emergency lights. Every passing vehicle carried on without slowing now, as though the world beyond the guardrail had already moved on. Yet for the three people standing beside the highway, the next few minutes would quietly redefine everything that had happened since the stop began. Reynolds spoke with the calm confidence of someone interested only in facts. "Ma'am, thank you again for your cooperation. I have one more question. Is there anything that would help us understand why your office has been trying to reach you so persistently?" Ava answered without hesitation. "Yes, Sergeant. I am expected to lead a federal legal briefing that should have started nearly 30 minutes ago." Brooks looked toward her immediately. "Lead the meeting?" Ava nodded. "That is correct." Brooks folded his arms again, still unconvinced. "Anyone can say they work for the government." Ava remained composed. "That is true." She reached into the inside pocket of her navy blazer but stopped before removing anything. "Sergeant, with your permission, I have official identification that will answer your questions." Reynolds gave a slight nod. "You may retrieve it slowly." Ava carefully removed a slim black leather credential holder and extended it toward him with both hands. There was no dramatic gesture, no attempt to impress anyone, only the quiet confidence of someone presenting an ordinary work credential. Imagine standing there after nearly an hour of unanswered questions, knowing the truth has been with you the entire time, waiting only for someone willing to look at it without prejudice. Reynolds accepted the credential respectfully and opened it beneath the glow of his flashlight. His eyes paused for a fraction of a second before moving carefully across every line. The official seal was unmistakable. The photograph matched perfectly. The title beneath the name immediately explained the repeated phone calls, the protected files inside the briefcase, and the urgency surrounding the delayed meeting. Before Reynolds spoke a single word, Ava's phone illuminated once again inside the center console. This time the screen remained visible long enough for him to notice that the incoming call originated from the United States Attorney's Office. He looked from the phone back to the credential in his hand, then quietly closed the leather holder. Brooks searched the sergeant's face for some sign that his suspicions had finally been confirmed, but instead he saw something entirely different. Professional concern replaced routine confidence. Reynolds handed the credential back to Ava with both hands. "Thank you, ma'am." His voice carried a noticeably different tone now. Brooks frowned. "Sergeant, what exactly does that identification say?" Reynolds turned toward him slowly before answering. "Officer Brooks, this confirms that Ms. Carter is a United States attorney." The words settled over the quiet highway with surprising weight. Brooks stared at Ava for several long seconds, replaying every assumption he had made since the flashing lights first appeared in her rearview mirror. At that exact moment, Reynolds's radio crackled once again. Headquarters requested an immediate update after receiving multiple inquiries from federal officials attempting to determine why one of their senior attorneys had not arrived. Reynolds reached for the radio, took a measured breath, and realized that the next transmission would change far more than the status of a routine traffic stop. SUA Sergeant Michael Reynolds lifted the radio to his shoulder and answered headquarters with measured professionalism while Daniel Brooks remained motionless beside the patrol vehicle. His attention fixed on Ava Carter as though he were seeing her for the first time. Headquarters, this is Sergeant Reynolds. Identity has been confirmed. The driver is a United States attorney. I will provide a full update in just a moment. There was a brief pause before the dispatcher responded in a noticeably different tone. Sergeant, stand by. The chief has requested immediate contact after receiving multiple inquiries from federal officials. Reynolds acknowledged the transmission and slowly lowered the radio. The atmosphere along the highway had changed completely. Only minutes earlier, Brooks believed he was directing every part of the encounter. Now the situation was being guided by facts rather than assumptions. Ava remained exactly where she had stood since the traffic stop began. She did not celebrate the confirmation of her identity. She did not criticize Brooks or remind him how long she had been delayed. She simply waited with the same quiet patience that had defined every minute of the encounter. Imagine discovering that the person you questioned for nearly an hour never needed to raise their voice because the truth had been standing beside you from the very beginning. Reynolds stepped toward Ava and spoke with genuine respect. Ma'am, with your permission, I recommend that you answer the next call from your office. Ava nodded. Thank you, Sergeant. She retrieved her phone and accepted the incoming call almost immediately. This is Ava Carter. The familiar voice on the other end sounded relieved. Ava, we have been trying to reach you. Everyone is here, and the meeting has been delayed. Are you safe? Yes, she answered calmly. I was involved in an extended traffic stop, but everything is being resolved professionally. There was a short silence before the caller spoke again. We understand. Travel safely. The meeting will begin when you arrive. Ava thanked the caller and ended the conversation before placing the phone back inside her vehicle. Brooks listened to every word without interruption. Each sentence quietly erased another assumption he had made. Reynolds turned toward him. Officer Brooks, I need you to return Ms. Carter's documents. Brooks immediately reached into his citation folder and handed over her driver's license, registration, and insurance card. His movements were slower now, not because he hesitated, but because he finally understood the weight of the moment. Ma'am, he said, choosing his words carefully. Here are your documents. Ava accepted them politely. Thank you. Reynolds looked from Brooks to Ava before speaking again. Ms. Carter, on behalf of this department, I apologize for the unnecessary delay. You have been cooperative and professional throughout this encounter. Ava offered a small, respectful smile. I appreciate that, Sergeant. My hope is simply that every driver receives the same careful consideration before conclusions are reached. Her words were calm, but they settled over the quiet highway with unmistakable meaning. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully because he understood exactly what she meant. Professionalism was never supposed to depend on a person's occupation, appearance, or title. It was supposed to begin the moment an officer approached a vehicle. As Ava prepared to continue her trip, Reynolds's department-issued phone began ringing. He glanced at the screen and immediately recognized the caller. It was the chief of police. He answered without delay, listened for several seconds, and his expression became noticeably more serious. When the call ended, he looked toward Brooks and quietly said, Officer, once Ms. Carter departs, you and I are returning to headquarters. The chief wants to review everything that happened here tonight. The sound of Ava Carter's engine faded into the evening as her sedan merged smoothly back onto Highway 17, disappearing beneath a stream of headlights moving toward Richmond. She never looked into the rearview mirror to see whether anyone was watching. Her attention had already returned to the responsibilities waiting for her at the federal courthouse. Behind her, however, silence settled over the shoulder of the highway in a way Daniel Brooks had never experienced before. The flashing emergency lights continued reflecting across the pavement, but the certainty he had carried throughout the stop had disappeared completely. Sergeant Michael Reynolds stood beside the patrol vehicle for a long moment before speaking. Officer Brooks, secure your equipment and prepare to return to headquarters after we clear this scene. Brooks nodded quietly. Yes, Sergeant. There was no argument because there was nothing left to argue about. Every record check had confirmed the same facts. Every document had been valid. Every instruction Ava had followed had been calm and professional. Imagine replaying the last hour in your mind and realizing that every answer you doubted had been true from the very beginning. Sometimes the hardest lesson is not discovering that someone else was right. It is recognizing the moment your own assumptions became stronger than the evidence in front of you. Reynolds completed the final entries in the incident log before approaching Brooks one last time. "Tell me honestly," he said, "if you had known who she was when you first walked up to that vehicle, would this stop have lasted this long?" Brooks lowered his eyes toward the pavement. Several seconds passed before he answered. "Probably not." Reynolds nodded slowly. "That answer is exactly why this situation matters." Brooks looked up without speaking. Every driver deserves the same level of professionalism before we know anything about them. Titles should never improve the quality of our judgment because that quality is supposed to exist from the first moment we make contact. The words settled heavily between them. Brooks understood that the conversation was no longer about one attorney or one traffic stop. It was about the responsibility carried by every uniform and every decision made behind it. Back at the federal courthouse, Ava quietly entered the conference room nearly an hour later than planned. Every person around the table stood as she arrived, not because of ceremony, but because everyone understood the unusual circumstances that had delayed her. A senior official asked softly, "Are you all right?" Ava smiled politely as she placed her briefcase on the conference table. "Yes, thank you for waiting." Another attorney looked concerned. "Do we need to address what happened?" Ava paused briefly before answering. "The proper people are already handling it. Let us focus on the work we came here to do." No one asked another question. The meeting began immediately, and within minutes the room shifted its attention back to the federal matters that had brought everyone together. Meanwhile, inside the patrol vehicle heading back toward headquarters, Brooks stared quietly through the windshield while the city lights grew brighter in the distance. The radio remained unusually quiet. Even routine dispatch calls seemed farther away than usual. He realized that the most important conversation of the night would not happen over the radio or beside the highway. It would happen inside a conference room where body camera footage, dispatch records, and every decision made during the stop would be reviewed one fact at a time. For the first time since beginning his shift, Daniel Brooks hoped that the truth would be examined just as carefully as Ava Carter had asked from the very beginning. The conference room at police headquarters felt very different from the busy highways and flashing emergency lights that had filled the evening only hours before. Bright fluorescent lights reflected across polished tables while several department supervisors quietly organized printed reports, dispatch records, and body camera reference numbers into carefully labeled folders. There were no raised voices, no dramatic accusations, and no rushed conclusions. Everything followed established procedure because accountability, like justice, depended on facts rather than assumptions. Daniel Brooks entered the room carrying a notebook beneath one arm before taking the seat assigned to him. Across the table sat Sergeant Michael Reynolds, Lieutenant Karen Mitchell, and a representative from Internal Affairs who joined through a secure video conference. The atmosphere remained professional, but everyone understood the importance of the review that was about to begin. Lieutenant Mitchell looked toward Brooks before speaking. "Officer Brooks, this is an administrative review of today's traffic stop. Our purpose is to evaluate the facts exactly as they occurred." Brooks nodded quietly. "Yes, Lieutenant." The first body camera recording appeared on the large monitor at the front of the room. Every greeting, every instruction, every question, and every response unfolded exactly as they had happened beside Highway 17. No one's memory needed to fill in missing details because the recording preserved every minute with remarkable clarity. Imagine watching your own decisions from the perspective of someone who has never met you before. Every assumption suddenly becomes visible in ways that are impossible to ignore. The supervisors watched carefully as Ava Carter answered each question respectfully, provided every requested document, and followed every instruction without hesitation. They noted the repeated records checks that confirmed her identification, the absence of violations supporting an extended detention, and the growing number of unanswered calls arriving from her office. When the recording reached the moment Sergeant Reynolds arrived, Lieutenant Mitchell paused the video. "At this point," she said calmly, "all available information had verified the driver's identity and documentation. Officer Brooks, what additional objective facts justified continuing the stop?" Brooks looked down at the printed report in front of him before answering honestly. "I believed there were inconsistencies that required additional verification." Mitchell listened carefully before asking another question. "Were those inconsistencies supported by evidence, or were they based on your personal interpretation?" The room became completely silent. Brooks took a slow breath before responding. "Looking back, they were based on my interpretation." No one interrupted him. Reynolds quietly folded his hands on the table, allowing the answer to settle naturally. The Internal Affairs representative requested copies of the dispatch recordings, dashboard camera footage, and written incident reports so every part of the encounter could be reviewed under department policy. Mitchell explained that the review would continue according to established procedures and that every finding would be documented objectively. There would be no shortcuts because the integrity of the process mattered as much as the outcome itself. Across the city, Ava Carter finally concluded the federal meeting that had been delayed by the traffic stop. As colleagues gathered their files, one attorney quietly asked whether she planned to file a personal complaint. Ava closed her briefcase and smiled gently. "The process already exists for a reason," she replied. "When everyone follows it honestly, the facts are strong enough to speak for themselves." While she left the courthouse and disappeared into the cool evening air, another memorandum was quietly delivered inside police headquarters, requesting that the administrative review move forward without delay. Daniel Brooks looked at the document resting on the conference table and slowly realized that the next decision would no longer belong to him. Several weeks passed before the administrative review reached its final conclusion, and throughout that time every step followed established department policy rather than public opinion or personal emotion. Body camera recordings were examined alongside dashboard camera footage, dispatch communications, supervisor reports, and written statements from everyone involved in the traffic stop. The timeline remained remarkably consistent from beginning to end. Every verified fact pointed in the same direction. Ava Carter had cooperated fully, provided valid documentation immediately, answered every question respectfully, and followed every lawful instruction without resistance. The review focused not on her profession or title, but on whether the decisions made during the stop reflected the department's own standards of fairness, objectivity, and professionalism. Imagine realizing that the evidence capable of changing a career was never hidden. It had been recorded from the very first minute, waiting only for someone willing to review it without assumption. Daniel Brooks attended the final administrative meeting quietly, listening as the review board summarized its findings one section at a time. The conclusion emphasized that law enforcement authority carries a responsibility to evaluate facts impartially, and that prolonged investigative decisions must always be supported by objective evidence rather than personal interpretation alone. After the review process was completed and all recommendations had been considered through the department's established procedures, Brooks was informed that his employment with the department would come to an end. He accepted the decision without argument. As he gathered the few personal belongings from his locker and walked through the familiar hallway one final time, he paused beneath the department emblem mounted near the main entrance. The building looked exactly as it had on every previous shift, but he understood that one evening on Highway 17 had changed the direction of his life forever. Across the city, Ava Carter continued serving in the United States Attorney's Office with the same quiet professionalism that had defined her long before the traffic stop ever occurred. She declined requests for interviews and chose not to speak publicly about the incident. When colleagues asked why she remained so private, she simply answered that the outcome had never been about one individual. It had always been about preserving trust in a system that depends on fairness for every person who encounters it. Several days later, Sergeant Michael Reynolds received a handwritten note delivered to his office. Inside was a single sentence written in neat blue ink. "Thank you for remembering that procedure protects everyone equally." Reynolds read the message twice before placing it carefully inside his desk drawer, knowing that he would remember both the note and that evening for the rest of his career. During the department's next professional standards training, supervisors used the incident as an educational example without identifying anyone by name. New officers were reminded that respect must never depend on appearance, occupation, or assumption because every encounter begins with the same obligation to seek the truth through facts. The instructor ended the session with a simple observation that left the room completely silent. You never know who someone is when you first approach a vehicle, but you always know who you are supposed to be. Months later, thousands of drivers continued traveling along Highway 17 without realizing that. One ordinary stretch of pavement had quietly become the setting for a lesson far greater than a routine traffic stop. Some stories end with anger, others end with applause. This one ended with accountability, dignity, and a simple truth that deserves to outlive every uniform and every title. A badge may grant authority, but only character earns lasting respect, and justice is strongest when it belongs to everyone before anyone's name is ever known.